design of the conference was that we should move from these large questions of what's achievable in the structure of the economy as a whole to a consideration that's focused more on the real resource issues and the challenge of achieving the energy transition that's necessary to deal with the problem of climate change to the extent that it can be dealt with. And so we are very lucky today to have a panel with a number of people who can speak to this question from a standpoint of real expertise, as well as people who will speak to it also from the political and to a degree administrative and financial angles. And I'm pleased to turn the proceedings over to Professor Michael Marder of the Department of Physics, who has been my friend and colleague here since practically the day I arrived in 1985. So, Michael, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Jamie. It's very illuminating for me as someone from the physics department to listen to such discussions. How many people in the audience would call themselves physicists? I suspected as much. The previous session on constraints on the Green New Deal is about as orthogonal to my way of thinking about things as anything could be. My mind immediately goes to a nation of laws, not men, by which I mean the first and second laws of thermodynamics. And the constraints that come from those are of a very different type. In this panel, we'll have 4 presenters. Because the number has gone down relative to what was at first anticipated, we'll be able to give each presenter about 15 minutes, and that should still leave plenty of time for questions. In addition, I was given permission to say just a few things in the beginning, and so I will, but this will be very, very brief. The topic of this panel is to be climate and energy, and for me it's a very good thing to see these combined together. I think that in political narratives they're most frequently these days posed as opposites, and there are 2 competing narratives. In each of them, one is the hero and the other one is the villain. In one of the narratives, the fossil fuel industry in particular uses political power in order to delay response to the climate crisis. And in another narrative, the people worried about the climate crisis are provoking hysteria and will damage growth and jobs. I think both of these narratives are mistaken largely because they put climate and energy in opposition. And this, I think, misstates the real problem altogether. The real problem is that the 2 are bound up with each other. And I'll offer just 2 quick analogies to explain what I mean. One analogy is the old vision of the heat engine. And the heat engine requires 2 things in order to function. It requires heat and a source of fuel, and it requires a cold place, which is also a place where it puts out the waste. And what's interesting is that you cannot have any production from it if you don't have those 2 things simultaneously. They don't compete with each other. They are separate functions, and they're both necessary. Another analogy was, in a way, already brought up. It was the Ulysses project. Odysseus knew this problem because once the crew was relieved from being pigs and were about to set out on their way, they first of all had to pass the sirens, but then after the sirens, they came to the most difficult place of all, which was where they had to pass between Scylla and Charybdis. And there was no good choice to be had. Whichever direction the ship went, there were going to be losses. And I think climate and energy pose a similar dilemma. There's, at the moment, great focus on the threat to human welfare that comes from the destruction of the resources in the planet. But there's an equal threat, maybe in a way more obvious so that we can't see it, which would come from the reduction in the resources, in the provisions that we have from cheap and abundant energy. Lose either one of them simultaneously when faced catastrophe, they're just from different sides. And so the technical point, it seems to me, is to steer between these twin threats, and we don't even know if there exists a path. I think technically we just don't know. So with that, I'm going to turn things over. I'll say one final thing, which I was encouraged at dinner yesterday to mention. I've tried to estimate simply the energy cost of making the energy transition, which is to say, calculate the embedded energy in a world's worth of infrastructure that is green. And my quick estimate is that roughly a minimum of 10% of the world's proven petroleum reserves would have to be employed in order to construct minimal energy infrastructure. This is certainly a lower bound, and there is no alternative to it. That is to say, you can't bootstrap the green energy to get the green energy. It cannot be done. Dollar value of this, I think, is less significant, but it comes out to be 10 trillion, which is not actually all that much, but I don't believe the dollar estimate as much as I believe the energy estimate. So the final thought, which I will throw out, is that if this estimate is correct, then the Green New Deal cannot itself be green. It has to be willing to tolerate and live with the consumption of fossil fuels, perhaps even on an unprecedented scale, to get to the point where they're no longer needed. And I think that at least has to be considered, whether it's palatable or not. So finally, we get to the panel. Our speakers will be Sandra Benčić, coordinator of Možemo, We Can, a left-green political party that was founded earlier this year, February 11th. Amanda Masino from the Department of Biology at Huston-Tillotson University. She co-advises an environmental student group, Green is the New Black, and co-founded Building Green Justice Forum. Jing Chen from University of Northern British Columbia. His specialty is the application of thermodynamic ideas to economics and has written a well-regarded and essential book on this topic. And June Sakara at the Heilbronner Center for Capitalism Studies at the New School for Social Research, where she's rethinking measurement of public sector production and the role of government in climate. So, Sandra, if you'd care to take things from here.
Okay. Hello, everybody. So my name is Sandra Benčić, and I'm here today in the role of a politician. I'm also a lawyer, and I truly don't know which one is worse for the general public, so let's stick to my name, just to the name. But I'm representing a political platform which has been recently established in Croatia. It's a green left platform and run by the party Možemo. But it also consists of two friendly parties with which we have formed the first green left coalition. And define the program which is based actually on the concept of the Green New Deal. Why am I saying this platform? Because for us the political party is really a tool for getting into the election process, but the platform is much broader. People do not have to be the members of the party in order to participate in the political life of the platform and to participate in the design of the potential political solutions for the key challenges that we have today. First, before we actually start, I would really like to reflect on the last lecture we had during the lunch, which was really great and really relevant for Croatia and relevant for this subject. Croatia is one of the countries that had a problem with the public debt and the problem with the deficit under the European Commission rules, and we were under the scrutiny of the European semester, and we had to reduce the deficit in 2 years for half, practically. So it was a really big challenge. Unfortunately, our government accepted that challenge and succeeded. And now we have a surplus which is financing our public debt, which was at 90% of the GDP. Now it's lower. But the costs of that were lack of investments into crucial social and economic fields. So barely we don't have investments practically anymore. And one of the crucial reforms, which was the reform of the education system, and another reform which was also connected with the climate change mitigation strategies and greening our industry, both didn't happen because of that. So it's really relevant what we heard about public debt and how European Commission is actually putting the countries which are already in the problems and underdeveloped and under the development rate of the average in European Union is through this regulation is pushing them even further to the stall in development. So I wanted to present today a view from the periphery on how a Green New Deal, especially in the part of the climate mitigation strategy in relation to energy, can be can be done and how do we see it? Why the periphery? Because we are the periphery of European Union. We are also the periphery of the world practically. If anybody doesn't know, Croatia is a country in European Union, bordering Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Italy, etc. We are not, and we were never on the other side of the so-called Iron Curtain, although our president is talking and spreading that misinformation all over the world, especially when visiting US. So we were not, we were the part of Yugoslav Republic. So our question, first question is that does the energy transformation seek fundamental economic and social transformation, or we can just continue with the economic and social system as we have, or business as usual? So from 1970s, the world has been living beyond Earth's capacity. You know that, and you probably know that now we operate at 1.7 times Earth's regenerative biocapacity. So just to illustrate it, Earth Overshoot Day this year was July 29. In 2016, it was on August 8. So you can see how we are actually speeding up in overshooting the biocapacity of the Earth. So all this is happening, and this increase in overshooting is happening at a time when some countries, and big countries, big industries, have increased investments in sustainable energy sources, and where some countries have already significant share of sustainable energy in their systems, like Germany. Yeah? And this view, world view of the progressive forces continues to dominate with this notion of that technoscience is the most important factor in human development. And still, the prevalent view of the politicians, of the science, is that somehow technology will save us from the climate catastrophe. Of course, we do not believe that this is the case. And we do not believe that actually everything that we call green growth, green innovation, etc., is the panacea for the catastrophe that is in front of us. So basically our first question was whether the green growth is even possible. I know that for some it may sound quite radical, because people really do believe that greening our industry will stop or at least mitigate the consequences that we have today. But I have to say, very recently, even the Financial Times had a piece on actually impossibility of having really a green growth. So actually, we are exploring what are those other possibilities and other, do we have an, can we even imagine the world that doesn't have to grow at the rate of 3% every year? Can we imagine such a society? So we always, of course, get a case of Germany as a good practice example, and most common argument that the green growth, green innovation, and green capitalism is possible because it's just now going on in Germany. But what they do not say is that first thing, green capitalism in one country simply cannot work because it depends upon unevenness somewhere else. So Germany, as you know, also has shifted their large amounts of the production in other countries. So those other countries do not have the technology rates that Germany has. And the technology, and not only the technology rates, but also in this way, the costs of environmental costs are actually being outsourced and shifted somewhere else. So it's also a part of the story. And externalizing CO2 emissions. So we believe that if energy is produced and distributed as any other commodity, with primary goal to secure profit for those who produce it, who are intermediates, and for those who distribute it, we cannot secure, we will not secure prevalence of renewables, because what we have now and what is going on all the time is that we have a competition of energies. We have a market, we have a competition of energy which is based on renewables with the energies based on fossil fuels. Of course, that renewables are losing that game because the technology is not on the level where they would be cheaper than the fossil fuels. It's very, very simple. And what do we do then? Then we subsidize. We subsidize as a form of budgetary intervention. And we need that budgetary intervention because we see that, of course, market does not produce positive social and environmental effects. So we subsidize it from the budget. So, and what it comes to is that all the taxpayers in one country are actually financing profitability of one entrepreneur in sustainable energy or renewable sources. And we do not think that this is the way that we should proceed. Also, the other way around it, and the way that is proposed by certain advocates of a Green New Deal, is the taxation of fossil fuels and energy products from fossil fuels. We had a discussion earlier during the lunch on the taxation as a possibility. There will be certainly need for some countries to tax fossil fuels and energy produced from them. But we also believe that this measure can only be a temporary transitional measure, and it can only be applied if followed by hard policy on reductions. If it's only tax without hard policy on reduction and fast reduction, and what is the reduction in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, then it will just not work. We will just lose and not gain anything, and we will have actually no effects. But also, in order to secure this, we are aware that this transition will have its victims. And in order to avoid that and to avoid the situation of energy poverty and the situation of scarcity, we were thinking about the steps we have to take in Croatia in order to prevent that. When the transition comes, how we will prevent that some people will not be able to afford the energy, or that we will not have an equal access to it. So, first, our position is that transformation of energy system, in order to be in line with climate change mitigation, is possible if the politics take the leadership together with the science and expertise over the vision of the strategy and of the implementation of transformation. So what does that mean? That means that there should be a consensus. The capital interests and market rules will not, and have not until now, produce positive effects in regard to climate change mitigation. It's just not happening. We can subsidize it. We can have a number of campaigns and raising awareness, but it's not working. Politics has to take over, and on the global level and on a national level. And I wanted to show you how, what was our plan and what are our ideas on the national level in Croatia. So in some countries it's much harder. In Croatia it's not that hard to take over the energy policy as a part of the climate change mitigation policy, because we still have a public company which runs a public company which owns most of the production and distribution of the energy. So it's state-owned, yeah? Their production comes mostly from hydro sources and partly from nuclear sources, because we have a nuclear plant together with Slovenia, which is our neighboring country, but it's going to be, the production will end in 2025. Also from fossils, but we are meeting and even overshooting the targets of EU 2020, which means we have more than 20% of renewables in the system right now. It's because of the hydro. This company has 300 million euro of net profit yearly. This net profit doesn't go into investment into renewables and into investments in the energy sector, but it goes directly to the state budget. Why it goes to the state budget, and why is state taking that money? Because of course they have to service public debt, because European Commission said so. Yeah. Also, one of the very big problems we have with this public company are the pressures both from the European Commission and International Monetary Fund on privatization of it. We have these pressures for 20 years. We didn't privatize it, but we were forced to privatize the distribution and the market of the distribution. And now companies from Germany are coming in, mostly from Germany, are coming in and taking the share of the distribution market. I can tell you right away, it didn't have any effect on the price of the energy. It's the same, because at the end of the day, the infrastructure is a monopoly and sources are a monopoly, so there cannot be some big difference in prices. So, in addition to this 300 million, we also have 200 million euro per year, every year in Fund for Environmental Protection and Energy Efficiency, which comes from actually the taxes on usage of dirty energy, let's say like that, on pollutants. So that fund amount to 2.6% of the national budget. So what we are saying, we have enough money. If we would wanted to put it into the complete reconstruction of the energy sector, we basically already now have enough money. We don't even have to go into the public debt. And our strategy is that first step, what we should do is that energy strategy is part of the climate change mitigation strategy, because those are not two different strategies. For the time being, they are, not only in our country, in many countries. Preventing further privatization of the Croatian energy company, defining social and environmental goals for public companies, because profit cannot be only or primary goal of those companies because they're publicly owned. We want to make a shift from bureaucratic management to participative public management of public companies. It's also one of the very important things we are working on now. And of course, invest all these funds, which would amount to 3 billion euro in the next 10 years, into renewables and make a complete transition in 15 to 20 years. Also, we want to publicly subsidize energy efficiency and energy autarkic households and public buildings. This is one of our policy goals. So what we want to see in the long run is the investment in mutually supportive double energy system. So one which is national, publicly owned, and distributed through the national grid, preserved from privatization and and the other one which is based on households and public buildings and their production of energy and distribution through locally owned and locally managed networks, which are mutually supportive. So they are not completely, they are interconnected, but the important thing is that we also support citizen energy cooperatives, because this is the way how we will transform not only the energy system and management of the energy system, but also how the people deal with the public and common good, which is, for us, the road towards the more serious economic and social transformation. So, thank you.
Amanda?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Is this all right? There we go. So I don't have slides. I do have a few things to share. So in thinking about climate and energy, not necessarily as opposites, but as these two areas to consider when you're considering the Green New Deal or any of this green energy transformation, I want to talk a little bit about an area that I believe should be equally as important and planned and measured with the same degree of care that you would plan for climate mitigation, that you would plan for energy use and consumption and transition, and that's justice. I work at a historically black college or university, an HBCU here in Austin called Huston-Tillotson University. And the historically black colleges in the United States were founded after the Civil War with the mission of freeing educating the enslaved, the formerly enslaved, and their descendants. Okay? So there's a social justice mission built into the role of historically black colleges. And I think it's relevant, too, to think about who founded those schools when we think about this work. The HBCUs were founded by churches, many of them, because the churches were active in the abolition movement before and during the Civil War. And they became many of the founders of these black colleges afterward. The other wave of HBCUs were founded with the land-grant universities. And when the Merrill Act in 1890 was passed to extend land-grant colleges to the former Confederate states, the states were given the choice of integrating their land-grant colleges or forming separate land-grant schools for blacks. And so that's what they did. And many of those land-grant schools were not granted land, they received cash instead, which sort of speaks to the continual problem of the lack of generational wealth that we see in African-American communities in the United States. So that's a lot of my perspective that I'm going to share with you comes from that place of working at a historically black school in a place like Austin, where our black population, historically located on the east side of town, has been under tremendous economic pressure and has been displaced by gentrification for going on 20 years now, well documented by Eric Tang here at UT, among others. And so in working at an HBCU and in thinking about environment, what seems very apparent about the current climate crisis, about the current massive ecological and economic changes that are facing the globe, is that some populations are going to be impacted much more than others. And that if we're looking at the global south, or looking at the elderly, or the older, or the poorer, they are going to suffer consequences far greater than most of the rest of us. They're going to have less ability to recover from the impacts of climate change, like changes in weather patterns causing flooding and fires, like health shifts because there's shifts to the food system, malnutrition, changes in the water supply and diarrheal illness coming on, just displacement and poverty increasing as a result of this instability. And in many ways, that is not new. What is happening in climate has been happening around the world, but I'm going to give you some examples from the United States because that's the part that I know best. This has been happening over and over and over again, where those with more wealth, primarily white populations with wealth, are producing pollution that affects mostly black, mostly brown, mostly poor in the United States. In the environmental justice in the US got refreshed, I'm gonna say. It didn't start with an event that happened in North Carolina at in Warren County. So in the late 70s, 1978, a group of contractors was supposed to be disposing of some oil contaminated with PCBs, and they dumped it along the side of the highway instead of taking it to a proper storage facility. And that PCB contaminated oil soaked into the soil along the highways. It had to be scooped up and entombed somewhere. And the state of North Carolina decided to put those 60,000 tons of carcinogenic soil into Warren County, a county that was 70% non-white, very poor, had very little representation in the government. And protests broke out about this and delayed the founding of the landfill for several years. It's incredibly important to note that this was not a good area in terms of the characteristic of the ground. It was the kind of area where if you built a landfill, there was an excellent chance that whatever you put into that landfill was going to make it into the groundwater. The landfill was also built improperly without good leachate collection systems that could collect all of this material that would soak through the landfill and maybe make it into groundwater. So this event in Warren County kicked off some of the first protests in the United States about environmental justice, about landfills. And although the landfill was ultimately built, it drew a lot of attention, national attention to this pattern. And environmental justice leaders mobilized to continue the work. And some of the first things they did, and again, I'm going to point out that the church, the United Church of Christ in this case, was one of the actors in this space, was commission reports about who lived near toxic sites in the United States, who was affected by waste. And sure enough, when they completed this report, they found that it was African American, Hispanic, poor communities that were sited near toxic waste dumps and unregulated landfills. That was in 1980. 20 years later, they did a follow-up report, and the pattern had intensified. Some sites had shut down, but now, if you looked at who was living within 1.8 miles of a landfill or a toxic site, the majority of people were non-white, black and brown and poor, and indigenous. If we fast forward to where we are today, the same pattern is there. We have the water crisis in Flint. We have a water crisis in New Jersey now, in some municipalities in New Jersey. We have pipelines continuing to be battled about in indigenous lands. We have a pattern of national air pollution where if you are lower income, black or brown, you are more than 2 times likely to be exposed to particulate and nitrogen dioxide air pollution than someone who is higher income and white. And most of that is because of where you live. You live near a road or you live near a toxic waste facility. I think one of a single number that is the most indicative of this phenomenon is in the United States, your zip code determines your lifespan, right? Zip code destiny. Where you live tells you how long you live. It is the single number beyond your genetics, beyond your cholesterol number or your blood pressure or whatever other single measurement you might think indicates the state of your health and your likelihood to get disease. None of that matters. What matters is where you live. In Austin, for those of you who are local, the number between East Austin and West Austin in terms of longevity gap is 20 years between East Austin census tracts and West Austin, between the area that is historically black and brown and under-resourced and was the site of more contamination, industrial development, contaminated land, water, and air, versus the west side of town, which was protected and continues to be protected to some extent in our land development code. So I say all of that to emphasize that what we see and are going to continue to see in climate affecting some populations more than others is not new. It is very, very old. And yet, I don't think we are talking enough about how to control for that, how to correct that. Because much of what we talk about is how much carbon are we going to reduce? How much is going to come from which sector of which energy market? How are we going to balance fossil fuels with renewables? Are we going to reduce overall consumption? And then maybe we get to jobs. How many jobs are we going to generate and where are we going to generate them? But we don't talk about explicit justice goals. Any plan that is to address the climate crisis must also address economic stratification. Can't say you're going to lift everyone up. You have to undo the disparities that are there in the first place. You have to talk about education. You have to talk about reproductive health and access to reproductive health. You have to talk about all of those things that are measures of justice. And I don't hear that enough in the discussion of how this is actually going to be implemented. So that is what I offer, not so much as a biologist, but as someone who works at an institution and for an institution that is intimately concerned with social justice. If you do not make it one of the primary goals of your program, you will continue to perpetuate the inequalities, the stratification, the inequities that are in the system now. So that's my invitation to us all to think about how that can be a set of goals just as important as carbon, just as important as where your energy market is, who's paying for what. And I think that's the only way we can really go forward with this. Thanks.
So first, thank you for giving me a chance to talk here. Yeah, it's about by physical theory, economics. This morning or this noon, a lot of people talk about like constraints or pollution or this environmental change, right? These all we can, just like Michael said, we have to think about from this biophysical realities, because just like a lot of people have said, you know, if we want to clean this part, right, a lot of this dirty part go to other area, right? If we want to, okay, all parts have to be clean, then from the second law of thermodynamics, this part more clean, this means more dirty stuff generated in the process, right? Where this dirty stuff to go through, right? So we said that there's always there. So what we want to do is we want to do, okay, from the fundamental perspective, from this fundamental property, how can we understand all this, how nature enables us and constrain us? And from this very fundamental physical laws and economic laws, what can we arrive? Because we talk about, say, okay, financial and non-financial activities, but they are all connected. In what way they are connected? And that's what we want to talk about, okay? Actually, you know, so from earlier speakers, we already find that, right? For like biology, physics, they are all connected in our discussion. You know? But a lot of times, they are not explicitly in the theory. As many of us point out, right? They are not in the economic theory, but they are all there. So, and actually, you know, but implicitly, we understand them actually very clearly. For example, is Keynes, right? Keynes, because New Deal we mostly attribute to Keynes, and what he thought at that time. And he said that, okay, so we are suffering from the growing pain of youth. And he realized that we were at a youthful time. At that time, the population was quite young in general. And we remember in late 20s and early 30s of last century, there were a lot of oil fields being discovered, including a lot in Texas, right, and worldwide. That's what transition from the coal economy to oil economy. But as Michael pointed out, we need to build a lot of infrastructure at that time. That's the transition is a major reason for the length and depth of this Great Depression. And so that's why at that time, say, therefore we must not draw in our homes. We must push them out. Action, activity, and boldness and enterprise, both individually and nationally, must be the cure. Okay? That was his advice for the cure at that time. But does this biophysical reality change over time? Now let's look at today. Okay? Today we know that the reality is quite different. For example, in Texas, right? Again, in Texas, a century ago, it was mainly the low-cost oil field, right? Some people drill a hole, very, very shallow hole, and oil just pump out. And today we know that this fracking needs a lot of resources. Again, just Michael also talked about this. You know, we need a lot of resource input to get the resource out. The earlier years, we need very little resource input to get a lot of resource out. But nowadays, we do need a lot of resource input to get out. And in the process, we also generate a lot more pollution, Just we said, I mean, we talk about this, right? All the time we say the fracking process, the fossil fuel industry is very, very pollutive, right? That's like shale oil, this fracking is very, very expensive. So the net energy output today is much, much lower than before. So that's the physical reality, right? And this physical reality causing this biological, this demographic changes. So like a lot of like Jamie's books writing, he also point out that after 1973, right, the pricing, because this morning people talk about Seven Sisters and the Texas Real Commission, right, about this pricing was done in the United States, right? But after, I mean, because in the United States we already produce a lot, not much remaining left, so the pricing power shifts from the United States to largely to the Middle East. And as a result, the cost to the Western countries like States and Europe become much higher. And we want to maintain high living standard, and the only way we can do it is to cut down the number of babies. And as a result, from 1973, the fertility rate in most what's called developed countries, high-income countries, dropped below replacement rate. And as a result, over a long time, we have population aging. So we are no more at the youth, right? So biological condition and physical condition are very different from Keynes' time. So what is our response? What is our response, right? Oh, what would be Keynes' policy response to today's biophysical reality? So a lot of people we always argue about, right? Do we have constraints or not constraints, financial constraints or not financial constraints, or technology constraints? And I think, and also the constraint of physical laws, right? We will always want to say, okay, let's want to get high living standard, we want a clean environment, a green environment. But is it our goal consistent with physical laws? For example, like during this lunch talk, right? We talk about, okay, China is the biggest investor of green technology. At the same time, it is the biggest polluter. Are these two independent or not independent? They are not, right? Just like Michael just said, right? If you want to produce all this green technology, you are going to have to generate a lot of pollutions. That is from the second law of thermodynamics. So when we do produce this kind of, what we call green technology, and we generate a lot of pollutions, are they really green, right? Because these two, I think, are not independent. And from this, okay, because we know we are under so many constraints, we some say, oh, it's a bad thing, constraints. But actually, we can derive very, very systematic and clear understanding about the relations of these many factors, okay? So what we talk about, for example, how much government activities, how much, for example, how much tax, how much debt, what's the interest rate, right? These are, for example, fixed cost, a variable cost, because we say, okay, the initial investment is big, but the later maintenance cost is low, variable cost is low, or duration of investment. I think this is very important because we say, oh, okay, we have big initial investment, then everything is fine. But that's not the case. We know all this, what we call renewable investment, they are a finite lifetime. For example, wind energy, right? It don't last forever. Maybe last 15 years, 20 years, and that's very important. Because after 15 years, we have to renew them, right? We have the new capital expenditure again. So lifespan, duration is very important, and discount rate. And we also talk about the discount rate for the government and for the private entities are different. Why? What are the relation to these other factors? And also uncertainty. And we know that, for example, debt problems, when there's no financial crisis, it looks fine, right? There's no problem. But when financial crisis break out, they become big problem. So this uncertainty is very important to like that fixed cost, right? And also market size. And we see, okay, should we expand the European Union or not? Some people want to expand. Some people like Britain, they want to, withdraw from European Union, right? And this all how to return, because we say, okay, we are not constrained by finance as long as there's technically feasible, but there is a return there, right? Even we are not bound by financial return, we are bound by biological return, right? For example, if a country, okay, if we, the population become aging more and more, then we cannot just sustain the society because we need a lot of service from young people, right? Okay, so these factors are all related. So we actually, what we do is we develop a mathematical theory about all these factors, related to the factors. It's a very, very simple relation. Some people might be surprised, how can it be simple? We also think, okay, while social science is very, very complex, the natural science is very, very simple. But remember, 500 years ago, people don't think that way, right? People think, okay, we are expert dealing with the human relation, right? We have this complex societies all the time, but we know nothing about what's on the sun, what's on the planet, these stars, we know nothing about them, right? But we think we understand a lot about society. And I think this actually shows this is true. The relation about all these factors in society actually turn out to be, much simpler than what we understand about a lot of physics, that's again, it's very natural because our expertise, right? What we live in this society. So we must understand this society better, okay? And it's very, very specific because it's a very specific relations. So it gives a very specific policy recommendations to specific regions. Okay, so with high resource cost and aging population, this is especially true for these what we call developed countries, because in these developed countries, our resource has been depleting for long, long years, especially in Europe, right? And that's where the aging population are. And the same Keynes inside would suggest, the lower fixed cost. Let's go to the next slide first, okay? Let me just quote this John Keynes Galbraith, okay? So politics is not art of the possible. It consists in choosing between the disastrous and the unpalatable. So from this theory derived that most policy recommendations are not very palatable, okay? Not very palatable. But it makes our society more sustainable. So one is lower fixed cost. actually, so just like King said before, right? We should expand, invest more, because we have so much new oil. Oil is so cheap then, right? Just we don't have this the infrastructure to use them, to utilize them. And today is another story. So we should, reduce the structure, reduce the infrastructure, and reduce the overall fixed cost. And another is, maybe I don't have much time, we talk about more flexible regulation, okay? So what is that? So for example, we like to keep the temperature constant, like in this room, right? We want to keep temperature constant, but the more precise the regulation, the more resource we require, right? For example, in the wintertime, we need more heat. In the summertime, we need more air conditioning. But if we say, okay, let's make the regulation more flexible, instead just fix at 21, we may be between 19 to 23, then we need less resources. So when the resource amount comes down, we want more flexible regulation, less tight regulation, and that lower this fixed cost. And that's the lower fixed cost actually contain a lot of things. For example, this noon we talked about lower tax, and we said, okay, why this green technology, we cannot use higher tax, because the ordinary people will not benefit from this higher tax, and it's politically difficult. And here we give a lot of theoretical explanation and a lot more others, and because it's we don't have time, so I cannot go to the mathematics. But if you are interested, I'd love to discuss with you. And the results are very simple. We just use this Excel to draw these returns and graphics, and it's very, very simple. And also more more information. There's a paper, joint paper from me and Jamie, and for more background information, the first is the book by Jamie, The End of Normal. It's mainly theoretical, and the second book is by me. It's more The Unity of Science and Economics. It's more mathematical, okay, but the math is actually quite simple, okay. So anyone interested, I'd love to discuss with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, for inviting me to come to your conference. I'm going to be talking about what I've come to call government's new assignment to reduce atmospheric CO2, and what I'm going to get into is what my research has led me to believe is a real problem with a false solution. I sort of have a challenge here today because I've got to explain something that's taking place behind the scenes that I think many of you may not know a lot about. And I've got to persuade you that what's happening is of major importance and potentially devastating consequences, so that you can understand the basis for the new deals that I'm proposing. I'll propose at the second half of my talk. So the basic theme here sort of builds on what some of the things that Jing was just saying, that we're making public policy, climate policy, divorced from science. That's the basic theme here. I'm going to talk very quickly about what the driving problem is, the false solution being promulgated by numbers of scientists and governments, and the new deal that I'm proposing is needed. So the driving problem you know about, people have alluded to it here today. Atmospheric CO2 has gone way up. We're over 400 parts per million. And this is causing the global warming, and therefore we need, and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, tells us we need to not exceed 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees centigrade. Everybody pretty much knows that. So what they're saying is, the IPCC is saying, and the scientists are saying, of the 40 or 50 scientific papers I read in the last half year, so we're putting so much CO2 into the air that we must now pull it out. And the solution being widely promulgated by scientists on the IPCC, scientists who've read, who's written hundreds and almost, I think, thousands of papers, and governments, is negative emissions technologies. So just a quick, let me understand here, how many of you are familiar with what a negative technicians raise your hand if you know what negative emissions technologies are. Yeah, okay, about half people. How about enhanced oil recovery? A couple of people. Yeah, okay, good. And I'm going to talk about both and how they're linked. So just for those who don't know, so the negative emissions technologies that are being promulgated, there's really sort of two kinds in the techno-fix bin. One is carbon capture and storage, which basically means putting a device on the smokestacks of power plants and taking the CO2 when it comes out of the smokestacks. It's generally called CCS or CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The other way of doing it with technology and mechanical means, is called DAC, direct air capture, meaning pull it out of the air. This is a picture of a facility that was started with money from Bill Gates, who invested in this, and a scientist from Harvard. And then there's a whole other basket of methods that are biophysical, biological systems methods that are the natural solutions, as some people call them. But I'm going to dwell on the technological methods today because that's what the legislation and the policy is focused on right now. So EOR, enhanced oil recovery. This is a picture, an image from U.S. Department of Energy handbook on enhanced oil recovery. And basically what EOR is, it's a method that's been used by oil companies for a 3 decades now, using naturally occurring CO2 and sometimes water. And basically what's going on is that the oil companies' stranded assets, the oil that's left in the reservoirs that they can't get out by conventional methods, they're basically going in and they inject CO2, sometimes water, into the reservoirs, and that squeezes out the oil that's left in there, and that is then used to produce oil products. So enhanced oil recovery, these are some pictures of some EOR facilities. And it's now being branded as climate mitigation, and I'll go into that more. Climate change mitigation. And this is another illustration. Basically, some of the studies that I've read are saying that we can have clean coal and green oil, and I'll go into that in a little bit more in detail in a second. But before I do that, what this published studies show, and I spent months reading and preparing a paper. Michael's reviewed my paper, provided feedback on it. It's not done yet, but doing the research on what the scientific studies show about these methods, these technological, mechanical methods, and they basically are, you have to really read them, not just the abstracts, not just the conclusions, but really dig into them to find the following. So there's something that I've been calling net carbon balance impact. It's actually a suggestion I got from a scientist at BU. And if you read the studies, all of them, and you'll find some that actually tell you that these methods, that CCS, carbon capture and storage with EOR, emits 1.5 to 4.7 times as much CO2 as it removes. It's putting more into the atmosphere, more CO2 into the air than it's taking out. And DAC, the direct air capture, fossil fuel powered, emits from 1.5 to 3.4 tons of CO2 for every ton that is captured. And that's not counting using the CO2 for EOR, using the captured CO2. this is a factor, this resource usage is another factor that I looked at when I looked at these studies. And I was looking at these studies from a public policy perspective about what public policymakers need to think about. And these statistics here are really not in any of the general literature that you read or some of the popular press has been writing about this a little bit. It's just not being, I had to dig very deep in some studies to find this, it uses huge amounts of electricity and the direct air capture and natural gas. I mean, there's huge amounts of land usage. If you're going to use DAC solar power, it's going to require a land area that's 10 times the state of Delaware. These statistics are just not being talked about in Congress, basically, which is where laws are being passed. So nevertheless, governments are moving forward with these technomechanical methods. In the US and Europe, from what I can tell, in the US, Congress is passing laws. I'll get to that in a second. The UK has just issued a plan, I think it's a law now, with net zero as their target, but it relies on these technomechanical methods. And the EC has been more cautious in these technomechanical methods, but still, there is still talk in the documents that I've read of government subsidy for these negative emissions technologies. In the United States, this is a legislation that's going on. One law was already passed last year. They snuck it into a midnight bill to keep the government open last February. It's the so-called 45Q tax credit that's in effect now. And then there's 3 more pieces of legislation to support these technomechanical methods. They're going through Congress right now. So what are the reasons that are given for Congress to pass legislation to subsidize these methods? Basically, some of the reasons are that we won't decarbonize fast enough. There's no other way to do what needs to be done to adhere to the 2 degree Celsius cap. We're probably going to overshoot in any case, but we need these technologies in order to have any hope. And the governments should subsidize them because these unprofitable businesses, they admit that they're unprofitable, are climate mitigation. So I want to underscore this bottom line here that the business ventures are unprofitable because it's extremely expensive to capture carbon, especially from the air. And there's no way to do it, to make the numbers crunch, to make the business plans work, even if you're using the carbon for EOR without government subsidy. I mean, basically all the papers say that what's really needed to scale these technologies up is to have the government subsidize these technologies. And so what are the reasons that, reading the papers and some of the public statements from some of the proponents that are lobbying for and supporting these methods, I sort of had this list of some of the reasons that I think that this is happening, that these methods are being supported and legislation's being passed despite the fact that they actually put more carbon into the air than they take out. One is the IPCC pathways, that is the pathways of adhering to the 2 degree cap. The pathways that the IPCC has spelled out mostly require some form of negative emissions technology, carbon dioxide removal. And it's the path of least resistance for governments. That is, it's easier to pass subsidies for businesses than it is to do the hard work of decarbonizing a nation or an economy. The potential for more oil profits, again, from subsidies. The oil majors are pushing this a great deal. Next slide is on that. There's venture capitalists. I mentioned Bill Gates and other venture capitalists who are putting money into this. And there are academics with vested interests. Some of the scientific papers that are being written are actually being written by scientists who have investments in these businesses that are purporting to be climate mitigation methods. And the obscurity of the science. Michael, you're a scientist. I'm not, and Most of the policymakers that are dealing with this in Washington right now are not scientists, and to read these papers is a real challenge. You have to really get some help if you're not a scientist. And that's why I called on scientists to help me get through these papers. It's very obscure. And also the journalists that are writing about this in the popular press are not reading the original scientific papers. They're not digging behind the statements that are coming out, the press releases that are coming out from the oil majors and other places to find the statistics that I was just showing you earlier. The journalists are just not digging deep enough to find this stuff. And then there's creative carbon accounting, and I could spend a whole 15 minutes telling you what that is, but basically there's, it depends, I mean, one of the pivotal parts of this creative carbon accounting is that it relies on neoclassical economics axioms, basically demand for oil as contrasted to a need for energy. And basically it argues that the carbon accounting that's in these many of these papers basically says that since the method leaves some CO2 in the ground, therefore it's not all going back up into the atmosphere, that is better than conventional methods for for oil production. And therefore, since it's not producing as much CO2, it's not as bad as, therefore it's better, and therefore it's mitigation. That seems hard to believe, but that's in fact what the argument is when you strip away all the difficult scientific notations. So this is I put this together just to point out what's happening. This in the next slide. There's two main companies in the United States that are doing the direct air capture. One is Carbon Engineering. That's the one that Bill Gates invested in, and the scientist at Harvard. And then Global Thermostat is a company that was started by two academics at Columbia, one who's an economist and one who is a scientist. And they've been doing, there's two different sort of methods of DAC, and each of the two companies sort of takes a different approach. And basically, they just recently, this year, announced partnerships. So Exxon is partnering with Global Thermostat, and basically, it looks like what's going on is Exxon is basically buying up the technology, the DAC approach that Carbon Engineering has been that Global Thermostat has been piloting for the past several years. So Exxon will own that technology, that intellectual property. It will be resident in and owned by Exxon. In the case of Carbon Engineering, that one is a partnership with Occidental Petroleum and Chevron. The stories about that partnership have said that this partnership it relies on the 45Q tax credit. And this is a slide that talks about the fact that this is going global, and I won't go in, I'm running out of time, so I won't go into it, but the oil companies have just announced that they are going global with their plans for carbon capture. This is not mitigation, it's predatory delay. Just to get to the new deals, I'll have to really rush here. A new policy framework, because this is a physical metric, not a financial metric. And as Jing was saying, we need to pay attention to the biophysical basis of all production, the second law of thermodynamics. These are the analytic frameworks we have right now. They're all monetary. I'm suggesting a new policy framework that's biophysical and that has these screens, these lenses of carbon balance impact, resource usage, and return on resource inputs. And this is a biophysical measure, not a financial metric. And so again, if you look at these metrics, you'll find that what I found, that the methods show that these mechanical methods put more CO2 into the air than they take out. They'll show you that these natural methods don't do that, and besides which, the natural methods also have co-benefits that you don't get with the mechanical methods. Just one quick last point here, though. I want to say, some people say, well, we have to have these technologies because we're going to, go fry to a crisp. So we really have to develop these technologies at taxpayer expense. But what I think the argument is, if you do the science, the biophysical science and the analyses, you'll find that if taxpayers are going to be paying for this, then the systems should be publicly owned, just as sewage treatment plants and water treatment plants are publicly owned. And that the carbon that's captured should be used for storage only, and the carbon that's captured should not be used to produce more oil. Thank you.
So we actually have 15 minutes available for discussion, and so we'll welcome questions from the audience.
Hi, my question is to June. Thanks for your intriguing the intriguing presentation. But I mean, from a European perspective, where we do not produce oil, I was a bit surprised by the discussion going on here in the US. I mean, that if you burn fossil fuels in order to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, that this isn't really a good idea. It seems to be quite obvious to me, and also that if you use that to get more oil out of the ground. But I mean, as far as I understand, what we are discussing in Europe is to use DAC, for example, for times where you have an excess of renewable energies, because that's a big debate now. What do you do with, I mean, in Germany we have now a bit more than 50% of the electricity comes from renewables, and it's perceivable that very soon we have at least a point where there are times of the day and in the year where you just have too much energy. And at that point, wouldn't DAC not be a possibility to decentrally remove CO2 from the atmosphere? And the second point, I mean, the pricing, again, I mean, it's clear it cannot be something to just continue what we are doing and we try to remove a bit of CO2, but as a residual technology for the last bit of CO2, it strikes me as reasonably sensible if you have cost to remove the CO2 of, I don't know where that is, maybe $200, $180, $200 or something like this. This would be in line with the marginal cost of CO2 emissions, damage costs which are estimated by the German government, which, I mean, the German government puts that, or their environmental agency, at 180 euros per ton. So I'm very surprised that your government sees it at $7 per ton. So doesn't that make a difference? And couldn't then there be a place for this kind of technology?
So on the first question about the energy usage, if you're going to use renewables, the problem is that to get a result at scale, and I basically followed what a lot of the studies do and consider removal of 1 gigaton of CO2 to be at scale, because if you're not doing that, you're not doing a whole lot. If you do that, you're going to use tremendous amounts of energy. I would guess way, way, way more than you have excess renewable energy right now. As I said, the one statistic up there was that to get a gigaton removal using renewable energy would require the amount of energy consumed in the United States in 2017, a huge amount of energy. So I don't think you can have any meaningful, drawdown without using enormous, enormous amounts of renewable energy. I mean, that's what the studies suggest. And in terms of the cost, I didn't look at financial costs because I was really focusing on the biophysical aspects. All I know is that there's a big debate about the cost of the DAC, and there was a study that came out in 2011 that said it was $1,000 a ton. And then the most recent paper that's being quoted in the press, and the stories about this, was by David Keith, that says that they can get the cost down to $100 a ton. And David Keith is the guy that started and is still involved in carbon engineering and is promoting, promoting DAC. And there's, if you read papers by a guy named Herzog at MIT, just look up his name, Herzog, H-E-R-Z-O-G. He's at MIT, and he and others dispute the David Keith paper on the cost.
I have a question, I think, for Amanda. How do you think we could change the education system to hopefully improve our climate right now?
Well, globally, the number one thing you can do is educate women. And that will have an impact on family size, economies, carbon usage, all of that. So that is one of the most impactful things we can do, is education access. In the United States, I think, at least what I've seen in my time at HT, is we need to do more interdisciplinary education early on. I work with students who are primarily African American and Hispanic. Most are low income. Most are very low income. So they're on Pell Grants, which is the highest federal need category in the United States. About 75% of our students are at that level. And when they come to us, nearly all of them have never had an environmental class. The last time they had environmental coursework in their curriculum was maybe in middle school when they had earth science. So we are failing to put this into the curriculum throughout K through 12 education. We're waiting until kids get to college to try to bring them into this work where we so desperately need voices like theirs giving us input into solutions.
A quick question maybe for our moderator or anyone else who cares to answer. I would like you to put nuclear fusion into the picture. What we have now is nuclear fission. There's an international consortium building a different type of nuclear power plant in southern France called ITER, that I assume you're familiar with. There was always a big discussion in the European Parliament when we had to pass the budget of that project, because on the one hand, it's very expensive. On the other hand, some people with more technical knowledge than me would say that that was the way to pass between the Scylla and Charybdis of energy on the one side and climate on the other side, producing safe and potentially limitless energy. Is that correct?
I'm not a great expert, but I can speak to it. This is a subject I've monitored and remember monitoring since I was a graduate student about 30 years ago. At that time, I remember hearing talks that predicted that we would have working pilot fusion reactors no more than 30 years out. I heard a talk about 2 months ago from someone who is one of the chief world experts in this, and I asked him for the time horizon, and he said it's 50 years out. So I think you can extrapolate and determine that it may be a long time before we have even a pilot plant. I've gleaned other things from presentations that I've heard. The pollution problems associated with fusion may be quite extensive. Whatever containment systems are used are going to be bombarded very heavily, and the variety of radiation products are going to be created. And because fusion has not yet become a practical reality, there's been no need yet to deal with the types of waste products that will be generated. So the advantage of fusion is that potentially it relies on a fuel source that is abundant and could be cheap, but already from fission, which originally was supposed to be too cheap to meter, we've learned that by the time you make it safe and begin to deal with the waste, it becomes very expensive, and the current cost of nuclear is not right now competitive with wind. I think that's a great surprise to everybody, but that's the reality of the cost structure at this minute. So there could be a technical breakthrough. One can never rule it out, but my understanding is that absent some really exceptional breakthrough, we cannot rely upon either fission or fusion to get us substantially through the dangers we face. If other members of the panel are more expert than me in this, they're welcome to go on. But I've asked every speaker I've heard on fusion energy this question, and I've carefully listened to what they said.
Hi, thank you all for the panel. There were a lot of really interesting things, and I learned a lot. I just want to raise some points that I'm points of concern, let's say, or disagreement across the board. Quickly, first, you critique degrowth, green growth, but if we're going to be realistic, any kind of climate stabilization program that relies on reducing consumption is not going to get us very far at all. And just a quick arithmetic exercise. Let's say we reduce GDP by 10%, which is another way to talk about a Great Depression. If we do not change the energy infrastructure at all, we will reduce carbon emissions by exactly 10%, whereas we need to get to zero. So that's the problem with any kind of degrowth program. So I myself don't like to use these terms, just growth or degrowth. I think we need to massively grow the clean energy infrastructure and bring the fossil fuel energy infrastructure to euthanasia, death. And that's a more precise way of thinking about the issue. I want to just emphasize, you brought the point up about the nuclear, and it came up that the renewables is expensive. So I'm just looking on my screen right now. This is, I cited it when I spoke this morning, but I just want to quickly refer. This is from the U.S. Department of Energy, 2019 levelized costs of electricity, alternative sources. I'll just cite to the point on carbon capture. Coal with carbon capture is 10.4 cents. Advanced nuclear, 7.8 cents. Geothermal, 4.1 cents. Onshore wind, 5.6 cents. Solar PV, 6.0 cents. Clean energy is already at parity. Now, these are averages, that's true. So the average doesn't apply if you can't get the energy to specific sites. So the challenge is not new tech. Of course, it'd be good to improve technologies for renewables, but the real challenge is the transmission and storage and building out capacity. Now, to the point on building out capacity, I don't understand your math at all, saying that we need this massive infusion of fossil fuel energy to build out the clean energy system. The input structure for creating a unit of clean energy is not exceptional. So if we're talking about transitioning in a growth economy or even in a steady state economy, if we're transitioning from investing in fossil fuel energy to investing in clean energy, the actual energy inputs per se don't have to go up at all. And so that we can transition incrementally into a renewable energy system without having to spike the demand for fossil fuel energy. At least that's my understanding. And I'd never heard your argument before in any of the things I've read, and I don't understand where it's coming from.
Sandra.
Just the point on the green growth. What I was saying is that basically the idea and optimism on technofix, what June also talked about, that technology will save the day, that the growth doesn't have an alternative. But when we say growth, I didn't mean only the growth like a zero growth and, maybe you misunderstood me. What we meant is that in the policy area, we don't have to be slaves of this imperative that the whole economy has to grow at a certain %. What we are saying is that we have to publicly invest in what you said, the green infrastructure for the clean energy, but we have to divest into certain areas. Because what we think that the idea that we will invest extra into new energy infrastructure, but on the other hand, continue to invest in areas that are also polluting, that are also creating inequalities, that are, then we are not changing anything. Because very soon, we will again reach the level of which is not sustainable. So this is why we think that when we are talking about Green New Deal, that we are talking about the change which is not only connected to the energy and climate, but it's also to the economic system as such and the social system as such. Because, for example, if we have the situation with renewables, as we have in Croatia, where renewables and the energy from renewables is more expensive, if that electricity was not because of the regulation bought by the public company and then distributed at the same rates to all the households, then we would have the situation where for the poorer families and the poorer regions, clean energy is not accessible. Yeah? So this is why it has to be connected policy pack, and we cannot, I think, this is my opinion, we cannot continue on saying that nothing else will change and that we will not de-invest into certain areas. Yes, we have to de-invest in certain areas. Yes, I think we should shrink the financial sector. Yeah? I think we should shrink certain industries and even remove certain industries, materials from, from the... And we should really rethink what can be a commodity. What is what we say res in commercio? What is really everything a commodity? Are my private data a commodity? Yes, they are now. Is the minimum energy for the households really a commodity at the same level as pencil or whatever? We should really rethink that, because without that we will be in the same place in 50 years again.
So there was also a question directed to me about the estimates of the energy needed to produce energy. We're at time, so I'd be glad to continue that discussion afterwards. I'm not the only person, however, to have come up with this. I found at least one paper from some authors at the World Bank from around 2012 who had made essentially the same argument, indeed at somewhat greater length. But it would be wonderful if the argument were wrong. I would be overjoyed to find that, so I look forward to a discussion. Thank you all for your attention and participation.